Welcome everyone. This particular session is student organizing across syllabi and project briefs. I'll read the brief description. Beyond their pedagogical and theoretical goals, syllabi operate as institutional contracts that are used to explain and enforce the scope of a studio. Project briefs offer the footprint for the power dynamics of the studio. This workshop investigates the influences on and implications of syllabi and project briefs and opens their development to student consideration and involvement. And this is facilitated by Federico Garcia Lammers, Shiloh Hilbert, and Dakota Matthews Schmidt. And I am organizing. I'm Andrea Dietz, and you can direct message me if you've got any questions in the background. I'll be running things. I'll give a brief introduction to our facilitators. Federico is an associate professor and director of graduate studies in the School of Architecture at the University of Minnesota. Before joining the School of Architecture, Federico was a founding faculty of the Department of Architecture at South Dakota State University, where he spent 9 years helping to design the first accredited architecture program in the state. He is a co-worker and partner with Labor, a collective whose work is about the spaces between architectural labor and construction labor. His teaching and research connect expansive notions of citizenship with the labor systems that underlie architectural production. Shiloh Hilbert is a second-year graduate student in the Department of Architecture at South Dakota State University and is a member of the Student Advisory Board since 2021. And Dakota Matthews Schmidt is a recent MArch graduate from the Department of Architecture at South Dakota State University and served as a member of the Student Advisory Board from 2021 to 22. Next, we will look at a few of the housekeeping items. So by participating in this, you are agreeing to be recorded. If you have any concerns about privacy, we just encourage you to keep your camera off and change your identifying information. The recordings, this then will be available if you follow the link that's listed here on the slide. And then these are our Zoom protocol or Zoom etiquette for while we are in this space. We request that everyone turn on their video if you're able to and comfortable. This really helps with community building and making sure that we're all participating together. We ask everyone to take care of yourself. So take breaks, grab stuff to eat and drink as you need them. And if you need to step away, please turn off your video. That indicates that you're not around. Please add your pronouns if you're comfortable to your Zoom name. The slide demonstrates over on the right how to do that. So if you want to follow those instructions, that would be great. Please respect the people speaking and keep chat in the chat box to everyone to a minimum. And please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. And then probably the most important thing is to use the progressive stack protocol. And basically what that is, and I'm just going to do this really quickly, is to type the word stack into the chat when you have something that you want to say. And that allows us to kind of keep track of who's got something to contribute and we get to them in order. The only exception to that is going to be if you have some direct response to something that is being said right in that moment, and in which case you can just write stack and direct response after that, and we can keep the conversation flowing that way. Some more discussion guidelines: acknowledge and use and respect people's pronouns, use I statements, don't assume that you're speaking for anyone but yourself, listen very carefully to what others are saying, assume good faith and positive intent, respect the spirit of the progressive stack, as I just said, respect the workshop agenda and people's time. And lastly, these are democratic processes, very truly workshop in intention, and it can get a little messy, and we're all embracing that condition. And then one last thing before I hand it over is the introduction of the concept of the purpose of these workshops, which is collectively to put together a series of learning objectives that the lobby then is going to start to use as a way of moving forward and building on in order to change architecture education. So we will spend about the last 20 to 15 minutes of this session talking about larger questions and goals for architecture education as it grows out of this particular topic. So with that in mind, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over the mic to Federico and the students.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I really appreciate it. And thanks to Palmira also, who I know isn't here, but she's been helpful as well. My name is Federico, and I'm speaking from both ancestral and contemporary lands of Ojibwe and Anishinaabem's people. And before moving to Minneapolis, I lived on Oceti Sakowin lands for 10 years. So my plan is I'll introduce the workshop and the organization for how the next 2 hours will go, including the Moreau space that we'll be using. So I'm going to share my screen, but before I do that, I will put a link to the Moreau board in the chat, and hopefully everybody has access to that. And then I will share my screen so that we can see it. Can everybody see my screen? Has it worked? Excellent. So I think what we'll do is, if you don't have access to Moreau, but you still want to participate, you can certainly type questions into the chat and we'll add them to the board as we go, just in case there's anything that breaks down. But we'll follow the stack approach on Zoom that Andrea described. I'll just describe very briefly, in addition to some of the things that Andrea was mentioning, what the goals of the workshop are, and some of the flexibility in it. But I think we're just trying to address a simple question, or at least something that I've been reflecting on over the past 10 years, but certainly over the last year, which is as a form of practice, how can student organizing affect the way that we both imagine and write syllabi, project briefs, other documents that really influence the power dynamics of studio. And I think there are a lot of people and organizations that are doing very thoughtful work surrounding the role of syllabi in architecture and design education, certainly historically and in contemporary terms. But I don't think the workshop really will be an analysis of existing syllabi or a history of the role of syllabi in design education, which are both really valid and very important, but they're a bit outside the scope of the workshop. So my idea and the way that we discussed it with Dakota and Shiloh was that the primary outcome of the session would be a collection of annotated syllabi templates, hopefully, describing ways that can lead to strategies that can be used to support the role of student organizations in studio. So let me go through the Moreau board really quickly, because that lays out the organization for the next 2 hours and how we hope that the work of the workshop unfolds. And I'll make sure to return to the Moreau board and reorient everybody relative to the board as we go. Obviously, we were just talking with Andrea, it was organized for as many people as possible. So it's divided into a description area, which is very much mirrors what's on Luma and what you probably already read, and then a work area, which has 6 different points that correspond to the timeline across these 2 hours. The first point is what we're going through right now, and I'm already going into that second point where we introduce Moreau. And I welcome everyone to use any of the columns below in this work area to add any comments, questions, or thoughts that you have, so that we can start to keep things a bit of a record about the reflections and the conversations that we're going to have throughout the workshop. After that, Shiloh and Dakota will share some insight into the scope of the workshop. Point 4, an initial discussion about syllabus reading, and also what I think might be some of the blind spots in the workshop, which is the fact that we probably won't get to talk about project briefs that much, but there may be other projects or other documents that certainly run studios that we're missing, right? Or somehow we're not reflecting on. And then the biggest portion of the workshop, I think, will be dedicated to annotating a very generic template that we've made into these 4 pages that are below, using the comments tool in Moreau, so that we can start to figure out how a lot of the ubiquitous forms of building syllabi can actually begin to reflect some of the role of student organizing. So that'll be the bulk of the workshop, is point 5, and as Andrea said, point 6 at the end, having at least 20 minutes to reflect on how some learning objectives can emerge from the workshop. Are there any questions about that? Hopefully everybody has access to the Moreau board. I see quite a few people moving around and scoping things out, so that's good. Okay. So before I hand it over to Shiloh and Dakota, I think the potential, at least for me, to link student organizing with the design of syllabi, so that we could begin to address some of the imbalances, the power that happen between faculty and students and between faculty and institutions, began really during my last year as faculty in the Department of Architecture at South Dakota State. I learned a lot about student empowerment as the year unfolded, which led to my own resignation, but I think more importantly, it led to a series of actions that were taken by students that are still unfolding. And I think many of those actions were foregrounded by the agency of the Student Advisory Board, which is an organization that's made up of undergraduate and graduate students at South Dakota State University, which is perhaps not unlike organizations at other universities, but certainly the charge that they took in terms of addressing structural issues in the architecture department was admirable, and a learning kind of opportunity for me and other faculty. So I want to hand it over to Dakota and Shiloh, who are going to share some of those experiences before we jump into the bulk of the workshop. Let me stop sharing my screen.
All right, Shiloh, are you ready? All right, I'm going to share my screen here. All right. So, didn't share. There we go. So like Federico said, I'm Dakota, and then Shiloh is also joining. We're just going to kind of talk about kind of what the SAB was or is, and just kind of bounce back and forth a little bit for your couple minutes. So the SAB, so the South Dakota State University Architecture Student Advisory Board, or SAB, representatives are here to relay concerns of the architecture student body for the purpose of making them known. The SAB is a departmental organization of elected student representatives from each year of architecture. The organization's purpose is to act as the link between the faculty and the student body on information exchange, departmental functions, and student feedback. The SAB acts in the best interest of the student body. So really, this is just kind of like our mission statement. We wanted to keep it very brief on kind of like what we stand for, what we do. I think one of the biggest things is we don't really do events in any way. We just act as pretty much like what we have written here. So to kind of dive a little bit more into the 3 main purposes of the SAB, one of the big ones is information exchange, communicating to students the concerns that the rest of the student body is having, to the faculty and the administration. Also doing departmental functions. So as a part of the SAB, there's a student representative that attends each of the faculty meetings that are every 2 weeks. This is also kind of one of the big things in getting the student voice heard, and also interjecting a lot of the student voice into a lot of the decisions that are made for students, as well as creating and maintaining a studio culture policy. And then another one is student feedback. So this past year, we've looked at two ways of giving student feedback. Looking at student curriculum surveys, that was our primary first one, and really kind of looking at how basically having questionnaires on some of the courses that we had throughout the previous semester, and then giving answers and kind of that data to the faculty, so that way they're able to make updates or changes to the curriculum. And then probably one of the more heavier ones was an open letter that we wrote to the South Dakota State University administration based on the removal of our department head position and our transition from a department to a program, and then ultimately kind of led to, not the letter led to this, but a lot of the actions and a lot of the things that we brought up in our letter resulted in a lot of our faculty resigning this past year. So I guess what we really wanted to kind of delve into more for this presentation was kind of our student surveys. So really what our goal was to make for students to give honest and constructive feedback on their experiences within the class post-semester. For the SIB, this was a way of channeling their concerns and grievances into productive feedback to provide the faculty, rather than just students just kind of discussing it amongst themselves and just kind of mumblings of not liking how something's done, but actually taking those concerns and trying to push them forward and get reasonable things addressed. So the SIB had a lot of discussions based on like how we would do these student surveys. We really looked at how our process worked. We had multiple discussions on wording of the questions, how we would send out all these surveys, and whatnot. So our first survey was based on our first building studio that we had 2 years ago. The first building studio, which was a vertical building studio for years 3 through 5, so undergraduate and graduate years together. And the faculty reached out asking for some input on how to make the next building studio better and different. So the SAB went through, created questions based off of kind of some of the common concerns. And we then later took a lot of that data and compiled it into a summary of common points that we then gave to the faculty. And then the SAB continued doing more surveys. And then we gave a lot of the raw data, so basically just the raw comments to the faculty. And really what this kind of turned out to be is the faculty looking at a lot of our concerns and then implementing the changes into the course syllabi. And just on this page. So through the communication between the student body, the SAB, and the faculty, brought elements from the surveys and were then implemented in the curriculum syllabi. So the sheet over here on the right is actually an excerpt from one of the syllabi for the newest building studio this past spring semester on what were the overall areas of concern, what were the expectations of students, what were the expectations of instructors, what were the expectations of graduate assistants, and what were the expectations of the collective. And this was after a lot of, again, discussion with our SAB board and how we could kind of relay that information to the faculty. And it also, oops, sorry. So I think one of the really important things about this was that the entire student body became involved in voicing their concerns, kind of like I was mentioning earlier, rather than just talking amongst ourselves and kind of sharing our dismay and how courses were done, and the teachers or the faculty wouldn't really necessarily be hearing it. We took a lot of those concerns and brought them forward as a more unified voice for the building studio. So so I think that's kind of how the SAB tackled a lot of talking with the faculty on our syllabi. And then kind of one of our bigger things this past year was our open letter to the administration. So the entire student body became involved in voicing their concerns. That not only did make this an impact on the syllabi, but it became something larger to the point where an open letter to the administration is written about these concerns. Through seeing the architecture students' open letter posted around campus, our letter sparked the graphic design and interior design students at SDSU to also write their own letters to the administration, voicing a lot of similar concerns. So it kind of helped us be able to have a voice, or start to voice our concerns to the university administration, and try and get them resolved. So Shiloh, did you want to add anything?
Not at the moment. I would just say one thing is that the open letter was something that we didn't plan originally to formulate. We originally, when we were recognizing these concerns, numerous students were coming forward with, and that we ourselves were recognizing, we originally thought that it would resolve itself. It was a year of a lot of change in our program, from department to program. So when we were seeing those issues not being addressed or not being resolved, that's when the students decided as a whole collective to take action and bring these concerns to a larger collective. So,
yeah. And I think that's all we got. So
excellent. Thanks, Dakota. A couple of points before we open up for questions or just conversations that people want to have, or that other people are curious about in terms of this process, because I realize this is a very brief micro version of something that's stretched across a full year. Many of the students, including Dakota and Shiloh, I think understood at some point that the university channels that we are typically used to, or that perhaps we're encouraged to use, simply weren't working, simply were not being responsive, let alone being reflected in the writing of syllabi or other documents that are used to run Studio. And so I think part of the value in a lot of the things that they started to do was in recognizing that within a small group, and I say a small group because it's a student body of 150, so relatively speaking, that's small for an architecture school. There was the capacity of being able to collectivize around very specific concerns that a body of students that was elected by other students could bring forth, and not do it through the official university channels, which would be any kind of contracts that come up through idea surveys or other evaluations, or forums that are organized by dean's offices, et cetera. That's just not something they did. And I think in this short period of time, it was more effective because of how direct it was and how unified it was. I will say, just as an observation, but also just to point the kind of realities of the situation, is that since then, that approach for being able to have students' words and voices directly included in the syllabi has been, as far as I know, undone, meaning it is now apparently policy of the school and the college to not allow student organizations to do that. But that was just a knee-jerk reaction, I think, to something that they hadn't experienced before, which hopefully it's something that over the next year, Shiloh and others that are involved in the student advisory board can continue to advocate for, and say that it's an essential part of the culture of the department and of the School of Design. Does anybody have any questions or comments they'd like to make before we jump into the next point, which is point 4, which I'd mentioned hopefully can address some of the blind spots of the workshop, which is the fact that syllabi aren't the only documents that we use to run Studio or that somehow demonstrate the power dynamics of Studio. Any questions for Shiloh or Dakota, or points of clarification, comments, observations?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Sounds like it was kind of a nerve-wracking but also exciting time to be a student. So I wonder, there's been a lot of, I guess I've witnessed a lot of this kind of action taking place on Instagram and these other kinds of media types. And I just wonder what kind of organizing strategies you are using as a student body, and kind of how you are organizing, and particularly, I assume this is kind of in the last couple of years, so through the pandemic, what online tools you were using to organize.
So primarily the SAB the SAB was a part of the architecture program previously pre-COVID, but as far as like post-COVID, we just recently started up the SAB this past school year after a bunch of complications with COVID and whatnot. But as far as a lot of the organizing strategies, a lot of it was meeting in person. And then being able to kind of communicate and do little exercises through online Word documents, and then being able to come to our meetings and kind of have meaningful discussions. I think one of the big things was how we communicated to the student body. There was not one face that communicated to the entire student body. So each year's representative talked to their respective years. Since they've been with each other since the beginning of their educational career. And we thought that was a very meaningful way to help kind of spread the information and be able just to communicate back and forth. So I hope that answered your question.
I'll also touch on that a little bit, if you don't mind. So another thing too is that we, with the coordination with the faculty members as well, with connecting to the larger students, we were able to use the end of our studio class time or other class times as well to be able to understand the concerns of the students more. And then also towards the end, when we had written the letter based off of those concerns, we also did use the end of our studio course to kind of hold a viewing in which we read the letter to the entire student body that was present, and then also got signatures from that as well. So it was coordinating with both faculty, SAB, and then also the large collective student body. So.
To the extent that you're comfortable, I'm wondering if you all can just give at least broad strokes in terms of the nature of the things that you wanted addressed. The issues that you were facing?
Sure. So some of the big things were looking at kind of the change from a program to department to a program, and there was a lot of lack of communication from the previous department. Our previous department head communicated with the student body and the faculty very well. When it changed to this kind of interim period, going out of a department, that role went to the director of the School of Design at SDSU, and there was very little or no communication of anything from that position. And that was one of the issues. Another large one was a lot of where our funds going, since our program out of the School of Design paid a significant amount more than the other students did in other disciplines. And then a lot of it was kind of our infrastructural needs, such as like printers, computers that run our laser cutters, 3D printers. A lot of our computers were 10 plus years old and wouldn't work, as well as kind of forgetting a couple of them. Shiloh, do you have any of those offhand?
Yeah, I have kind of the list right in front of me. Change from department to program, faculty retention, like fiscal management, which is the money issues, technology. We also brought forth discussions about Senate Bill 55, discussing how the change from studio course designation was being altered and changed. And then also in our letter, we also had written in a previous meeting that we had with the director, where we brought to their attention all these issues which were addressed. So yeah.
Thank you. Laura.
Yeah, it was more a curiosity because I was wondering if you said you already had this structure, this representative structure before the pandemic, but during the pandemic you organized it to address these issues, right? So before that, I was wondering if it's something common to have this structure of this, to have a representative person like each year. At least here for us is this, like each class has a representative student or one or two, and then they attend meetings and we have this kind of structure. So I was wondering if it's something common or not. It's more curiosity.
I can respond a little bit. I think it is common in schools of architecture and design to have this type of representative structure. I think the role or the influence that they might have within the structure of curricula and within decision making varies across schools. One of the conditions that makes it vary, in my opinion, is the financial structure through which the actual schools are operated. So something that Dakota and Shiloh touched on, but I'll explain a little bit more, is that the model for the school that we're discussing is based on student fees, meaning all faculty salaries and all operational costs are run through student fees, not through tuition. So the program and the department doesn't see any tuition money. So it essentially operates as a one-to-one exchange between the number of credit hours students take and the amount of fees that are collected. And so while some programs might have some discipline fees, most don't operate with those fees exclusively as the primary bulk of their income. But in this case, that was a condition for starting the program. So I think the legacy of that means that any sort of student representation and involvement has to be much more direct in terms of the influence that it can have. At least my estimation as faculty was that, right? That if we have this one-to-one exchange that is unlike all the other programs at the university, which have a different financial model, then we need to have a very different relationship with student representation and with the role that they can have both in curricula, but also in the way that the money is being managed.
And you're on stack, Federico, so if you have other things to add.
One of the things I wanted to mention was something Shiloh brought up, which was, and it was a question that I think Tessa had as well. I think Dakota, correct me if I'm wrong, you and a few other members of the student advisory board approached us to ask the studio coordinators if you could have studio time to discuss a lot of the things that you were concerned with, but also to organize and to start to frame some of the issues that you wanted to communicate to the administration. And maybe my memory is a little bit fuzzy, but I know that myself and certainly the other coordinators didn't hesitate for a second. Meaning studio time, I think, can sometimes feel like this precious thing, but if we can open it up to a whole host of other actions and things that are surrounding education, not just the immediacy of the design project or whatever project is at hand, then it changes the context of the studio altogether. And admittedly, I was very nervous about that. But I think that that's one of the other things that certainly Syllabi can begin to reflect is what happens within the time span of 12, 15 weeks, what happens within the time span of the week and within the time span of the day when we open up to the possibility of student organizing being a part of the studio. Not in concept, but in practice and just giving time away. Does anybody have any other questions or comments? I realize a lot of this is compressed or maybe not fully unfolded because of the amount of time a lot of these things took to develop and to communicate across students, faculty, and administration. But hopefully it just gives one example. See, somebody else is on the staff as well.
Susan, yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to say that this is really impressive. I'm like really find the work that the students did here and the support by the faculty to be very impressive. And then I have a very sort of in the weeds logistical question. Does your institution do course evaluations or student evaluations or teaching? And was this done then in addition to that, or does your institution do like basic kind of course evaluation? They do.
Yes, this is a good question. I'll answer, and then Dakota, Shiloh, please feel free to share your experiences, because the faculty back end of what course evaluations are like and how they're quantified for both tenure and tenure track purposes and for assessing all those kind of things. I think, at least personally, they didn't seem to actually line up with student interests. And what they meant within the culture of the school and the department didn't seem to have the actual influence and the role in shaping curricula that I think student evaluations should. And a lot of the faculty agreed with that, including the previous department head.
Is there an open-ended, in your institutional course evals, is there an open-ended question?
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
You can set them up and design them however you like. And
in our architecture program, in the last couple of years, we instituted as part of our NAB accreditation process and assessment process, and where the feedback from those course evals, the student feedback actually has to be transparent on your next year's syllabus. So you work with your program director or chair on this, and both the positive things and the negative things. So you need to address and explain to the next set of students how you've actually addressed it. Now, I don't think it's anywhere as robust as what your student group did, but it's a small step.
Yeah, and I'd like to kind of add in on that. One of the, I guess, really important things, like I guess looking at our student surveys specifically, they were in conjunction, or they ran alongside the institutional questions or institutional surveys. But I think one of the unique things is that the questions were created by the student body and the student representatives. We asked our faculty what they would like to look for, but it wasn't necessarily the faculty that wrote the questions. We wanted to kind of have that power to write the questions and be able to give our voice, but then also kind of, organize it around ourselves. And I guess as far as our letter, that was kind of as Shiloh mentioned, kind of a nuclear option that we had to do because we didn't feel as if our needs were being met. So.
Peggy.
I was struck, Federico, by your using as proof for why your mechanisms for student participation should be different in architecture because of their different financial relationship to the rest of the administration, which kind of gets them where it hurts, or where it matters, which is if you're going to talk money, let's talk money. And I'm wondering whether that is always the only recourse. I'm just wondering where those places where we can't prove that, although I suspect part of what you're telling us is that you could probably find that everywhere, as in architecture is making more money for the department than anything else, and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I guess I'm just wondering whether you can think about how that would work as an argument or not work as an argument for other institutions that have different financial situations.
No, I think that's a really valid point. I think we, for such a long time, operated under this very unusual model. And so we found ways to protect ourselves or to advocate for students and faculty and the community around us based on that model. I think one of the aspects that Shiloh touched on, which I suspect has affected a lot of other places and a lot of other institutions without knowing, is that there are particular bills, particular Senate actions at a local level, even at local city levels, that do actually have ramifications on design education, sometimes explicitly, sometimes not, in terms of access to education, and those things go past the immediate budget of the school. So Shiloh mentioned SB 55, which was a Senate bill that was introduced last year, and it was initiated by the Board of Regents in South Dakota. The bill, one of the recommendations that has already have been enacted, is to remove studio as a course designation, because it's an inefficient model of teaching in which there are too many faculty and not enough students, right? And so I think that there are other ways of evaluating this that then go beyond the financial stake, which in this case is an educational depth that you can achieve in a model that is unlike pharmacy or is unlike other ones. So that has been one way that I think schools of different sizes, different contexts could approach this, is to become much more connected to some of the local legislative decisions that are affecting somewhat directly or even indirectly, really, their education models. And I suspect that there are quite a bit of those. They just don't really make it into our interests, maybe. Not really an answer to your question, Peggy, but it's something that I reflect on more.
And no, that's exactly what I was wondering about. So yeah.
So I think if Dakota, Shiloh, if you don't have anything else to add, I'll turn our attention back to the Moreau board, where I was hoping that we could address some of the things in point 4, but we're already at a good spot to hopefully begin to do some work on a template syllabus and make some comments and annotate. But point 4, which is this initial discussion or syllabus reading, was more of a curiosity around the blind spot of the conversations that we were having as we developed the workshop, which was beyond project briefs and syllabi, in whichever order they come, what other forms of documentation are typically shared, produced, to actually run studios. And I just mean it in a way that reflects perhaps differences across different schools or ways that people practice, different pedagogies, all these kind of things. And it just seemed like the pairing of syllabus as a form of contract and the project brief as a strange kind of deliverable network were the two most common. But I'm curious also to see if there are others that people have used in their own teaching, or that students have seen as being part of the documentation that's used to run and to enable studios to essentially be taught.
We have a question in chat. Isn't the fact that the department is self-sufficient, faculty are paid, evidence enough that studio is efficient?
Yes. I think that this has been that's absolutely true. Yes, that does reflect that the model that was set in place to begin the department, which was you will teach a class and you will look out onto a studio of 12 people, and the students will know that they pay your salary based on their fees, and we can count, and then I will know that and they will know that. That is a reflection of the actual studio being efficient. I think part of the issue is that it's become flattened onto every other discipline, which doesn't have the same model and also doesn't have the same numbers. And so negotiating that and administratively understanding that we shouldn't take for granted the fact that students are in the institution. And also the second layer to that, in response to Jean, and maybe Shiloh, Dakota, you can speak to this too. The cost is is incredibly high. And I won't get into how much it is, but it's $420 per credit hour. So you can calculate 475, 77. You keep just like putting up, and I keep cringing every time I hear 475. So if the next closest is 20 within departments that are in the same structural, right, system, there's a bit of a problem, right? And so that's where the misinterpretations of efficiency being the thing that seems to rule every decision, or some pseudo form of efficiency, I don't know what it is really, that rules every form of decision coming from the Board of Regents and from the institution. That's where those confusions come from. But yes, I would agree with that sort of evidence about the fact that students are enrolling in the studios and faculty are being paid through that enrollment.
Great, and Michael.
Just in response to Federico's prompt about what other forms of documentation are
Yes.
produced, it seems to me that one, I guess, elephant in this room is online course management platforms like Canvas or Blackboard. I teach at the University of Utah, and a lot of my peers tend to actually just produce the syllabi on Canvas as opposed to a freestanding PDF or Word document, and allow that platform to decide for them, what sections, what's required, et cetera, and allow those to sort of organize the hierarchies, the relations between faculty and students. So I just wanted to mention that. It feels like a pretty important, not document per se, but something that does manage those relations.
I think thanks for pointing that out, Michael, because as I was doing it, and obviously I was on Moreau and I was working through some of these things, I thought, well, obviously this is another means through which students and faculty engage. And in the specifics of the case that Shiloh and Dakota were discussing, it's even a little bit more complex because we could not collect student fees if courses were online. And so that means that faculty couldn't be paid. This was a caveat from a Board of Regents structure, which is a whole, and this was even true during COVID, right? So there's I think that layer which you're describing, which is absolutely true, right? There's a whole other system of communication, of pedagogical ways of engaging that has to do with non-printed, non-physical copies of the documents that we're so familiar with, and whether it's Canvas or other online platforms that allow us to collect all those and to disseminate them too. That's a great point. Does anybody else have any other insights perhaps into other forms of communication, documents, specifics even to the techniques that perhaps you're used to using? But if we don't, then we can certainly move over to point 5, which I was talking to Andrea. I've been reviewing a lot of syllabi as part of new work that I'm involved in, and I was telling Andrea one of the beyond the specifics of content of studio, ways in which faculty approach studio differently, one of the biggest differences is just sheer length, right? So that there may be 4-page or 5-page syllabi, and I've run into 40 and 50-page ones. And so length definitely not equals depth, but certainly you can tell that there's a range of explanation and also of transparency, right? Like what syllabi are actually communicating, whether they know and whether the people involved are aware of the type of power dynamics that the course is engaging in, right? So we made a very, very generic 4-page syllabus template, which I think has some very common things in it. Each page has a set of headings. They're all under this point 5. And I thought one of the things that we could do either together as a group, or we can certainly break off into breakout rooms, although I know that affects the recording, Andrea, and depending on how people want to approach this, we could all do it together as well using the comment tool in Moreau, was to just add certain pieces into this really generic template, or certain areas that could be made much more explicit in terms of how student organizing and other ways of empowering students could find their way onto syllabi. So that's, I think, the approach for the bulk of the time that we have left, including some time for reflection at the end to work on the learning objectives. But I'll go through the 4 pages really quickly just for some context, and certainly.
Federico, you wanna throw your board up there, and we can also have that visible.
Yes,
as well?
absolutely. Let me share my screen so that we can do that. Yes. Okay. Perfect. Thank you, Andrea. Can everybody see that? Okay. Let me just zoom into this first page. Contact information, studio description, learning objectives. I think a lot of this is fairly harmless in terms of it's the most consistent way of starting a syllabi, and it's typically dictated by some type of institutional standard, right? And it perhaps should remain that way. I don't know that there's any use in really interrogating some pieces of it. One of the things that I find really curious is the scope and the ways in which studio descriptions are articulated, both in length and also in specificity as to what students' role is within the studio. And this goes perhaps to some of the things that Shiloh and Dakota were discussing in terms of what are some of the aspects that get described as part of student work, as part of faculty labor, as part of student labor that are included in studio description. So that's one area. Learning objectives is something that I think the school has really, this version of the school has tackled, right? How should learning objectives actually be developed? And who should be involved in their development, right? When does that happen? Should it be something that is much more, something that is revised and not static? I think maybe to Michael's point in terms of have online platforms really opened up the syllabus as a much more dynamic thing that can change and be revised and adjusted throughout the semester? Or is it just a more expedient way of communicating? Those are all kind of questions that I think are perhaps relevant to discuss. So that's page 1. Page 2 is something that I find really important, and it's certainly a part of every syllabus, but it's thinking about how to contextualize every single one of these pieces that, if not actually involved in the way that the power scenarios in the studio are understood, they can become very much boilerplate and copy pasted into every syllabus. And so that's, I think, something that is perhaps common over the last 5 years or more in terms of how are these really real and important questions and concerns addressed in syllabi, and what should we do to make it much more explicit and direct. The third page only has 2 headings, which is schedule and materials. I think schedule, they're my favorite thing to look at, to be honest, just because it reveals both ambition, but also whether there's a confusion between deliverables of a studio and what actually happens within the time frame of a studio. So schedules can be very generic in nature, or they can be hyper specific as well in terms of things that are expected on a weekly basis. And that really puts forth what the actual relationship is between faculty and students and the expectations that happen on both ends. But it's typically a one-sided set of expectations, right? So, and materials, I think, are much broader, both in terms of reading materials, things like this, but you realize very quickly that if we were very, very clear about what the expectations are from materials point of view, you would begin to understand different economic and financial situations to which students are placed in. Different levels of accessibility that students might require. So it begins to link to page 2, perhaps. And then the last page, I think maybe more so even than the online, NAB is the other kind of elephant in a way of how we can actually begin to address some of these conditions and some of the things that Dakota and Shiloh were discussing as critical student performance criteria, right? Do we want students to be able to organize and to be able to advocate for certain things that they see as relevant within the scope of their education as part of how we're evaluated as professional programs, right? And the kind of openness or lack of openness or uncertainty, and I'll speak only for myself, about the 2020 NAB conditions. That I think has certainly a connection to the heading that's above that, which is grading. Defining how somebody is quote unquote successful in studio, apart from what constitutes A, B, C, or D, I think is an essential part of how we can communicate with students and what their levels of engagement in the studio are outside of the grades that they want to achieve. So those are the 4 pages. How many people do we have in, let's see.
So Federico, I've broken everything down into 3 groups. That gives us about 6 or 7 people per group. To answer Laura's question directly, NAB is the accrediting body for the schools of architecture in the United States. It basically is the entity that determines all of the material that we're supposed to deliver and determines whether or not our degrees are valid or not.
Thank you, Andrew.
So
I think 3 groups would work. Perhaps Dakota, Shiloh, and I can be split up across the 3.
yes, and I've got that already. And I'm thinking we do what, 20-25 minutes, and
I think so.
okay. So around 20-25 minutes, I'll give everyone a kind of heads up that it's time to rejoin, and I will see everyone shortly.
Perfect. Welcome back to the main room. I realized I did all my comments in the little comments, and I should have done them in sticky notes. So I will spend time doing that, so that, because they're like some kind of mystery comment that only if you click on it can you see. So I will translate all those into colorful sticky notes that I think will be more legible. We have at least a half an hour, if not 20 minutes, to discuss some reflections, observations that people made in each of their groups. So we can certainly go around and talk about some of those. If there are particular things that people feel really compelled about sharing right away, we can do that. If not, we can just go through each of the 4 or 3 groups rather, sorry. And if you don't mind, I'll just get the process started with just some very specific observations that our group talked about. One of the areas that most of the people in our breakout room talked about were learning objectives, their validity, where they come from, how do they reflect flattening of certain standards versus an ability to be much more individual in our assessment, while still being able to measure collective action as part of the learning objective. So some conflict, I guess, in terms of how those are explained. Let me share the. Okay. Here we go. So I think some of the things that we talked about is whether there's a negotiable quality to the learning outcomes that, again, removes some of the static conditions that happen within the syllabus. I think in the conversation, we were trying to figure out how are those conditions also influenced by and push against national standards, whether that's the NAB or other conditions that are external that are pushing on what learning objectives are. There were conversations about how to contextualize learning objectives within a larger curricula so that students understand what's at stake in their education beyond the expectations that individual faculty might have, but that there's a larger framework inside of the community of the school, but also perhaps surrounding the school that are important to those outcomes. And I think that was also a conversation between how do you distinguish faculty roles, right? Between permanent faculty, adjunct faculty, what are the power dynamics between those that are oftentimes obscured in learning outcomes because perhaps faculty don't have enough or as much agency to express those. Please, anybody else in the group, correct me if I'm completely misinterpreting our conversation. One of the conditions that we talked about at the end was the idea of learning objectives being attached exclusively to a linear progression in education, which typically begins with year 1 and ends with year 5. And somehow the assumed notion that complexity is embedded into that progression, but not necessarily collective action or ways in which multi-generational teaching can actually happen, and multi-generational learning could happen as well as part of learning objectives. This was something that I think was really interesting, is how some of the learning objectives become a pseudo guarantee of cost or a fulfillment of that contract, and how that implicates students as a form of standardized product as well, that are embedded into some of our learning outcomes. So those were some of the things that we discussed as a group in the learning outcomes section, and they were certainly tied to materials, a little bit of studio description, and then we ended talking about health and well-being and what communities of care actually mean within studio, and how to connect that to potential schedules and being explicit about those schedules. And one of the things that occurred to me, and perhaps is a good segue for others, is how much schedules have no sense of recovery time embedded in them. So if you have multiple projects, for example, you can very easily read a project and go, oh, there's one project, the next project starts as soon as that one ends. And there are very few other, quote, high-performing practices, whether it's music, athletics, or anything like that, that in the 21st century isn't grappling with serious ideas of recovery as part of their practice and as ways of practicing some type of collective care. So that was one of the things that we ended on, how to begin to think about health and well-being as part of our syllabi. So I think
Dakota or Charlotte, you want to kick us off for the next group?
Sure. So what our group, I guess, started out with was kind of looking at SciArcs. We're the one. Oh, should I share screen? Sorry. All right. Okay. So we're the one with all the color sticky notes down here. I think one of the things that we first talked about was the SciArc, like original, for lack of a better term, constitution, and how like in that founding document, it was talking about students should be involved in the decision-making process on courses, and then how it kind of fell off to the wayside later. And I think we really went into a lot of looking at learning objectives, as well as I think studio description, where I believe it was Michael that brought up kind of describing the roles or like the titles of the instructors, or like what is the leadership structure working within like your department, program, whatever. And then I mentioned that I thought that was really useful because I never really understood what associate professor, assistant professor, lecturer, etc. Meant, and what power they had and whatnot. I think a lot of the other ones that we looked at were how to communicate, and I think we really looked at like contact information, and really how should we contact each other. Is there a way to kind of have one-stop shop kind of thing, or like where we can have all of our communication? And then I think one of the other ones that bigger ones that we talked about was so as far as like grading, could we have a discussion early on within the semester of what is the definition of success, and rather than it just being based on the traditional above standard, below standard, at standard grading criteria, is there a way that there could be just more of a discussion involved around the whole thing. And I think just as kind of like a takeaway from the whole discussion that we had is just having general discussions and just making sure that everyone understands what's going on with the course. So yeah, does anyone else have anything to add?
Laura's on Stack. I don't know if it was pertaining to this or not.
I can wait.
Thank you, Dakota. I think that especially where you were describing about organization of studio relative to faculty structure and how much we take for granted the fact that students know or understand that there's actually a significant type of power relationships that are embedded in that, whether it's through a particular type of studio coordination, whether it's through the relationship of adjunct faculty to other types of faculty. I think that that's something that we touched on as well, and it's something that is perhaps not foregrounded in syllabi or in ways that we communicate with students. We have one more group, I believe.
Laura, did you want to jump in before we switch groups?
I was actually going to comment on the first group, so I can wait till the three groups are presented. So give a general comment.
Sure. Let's see who else from that third group, and then Laura, if you wanna ask after we talk about that group. Does somebody from that group wanna jump in and share some of the observations that you all made?
Go for it, Shiloh.
Yeah, I'll share my screen. Okay, can you guys see it? Okay. We didn't get very far, but that's okay. We had some really good discussion. We really only touched base first two questions. And I think one of the main topics that we discussed with the confirmation was understanding and making it known what's a reasonable boundary for both and faculty communication. So whether that's keeping it personal or using multiple different communication channels. I know just WhatsApp, also like I know Moreau is also another form that's been used in the past at my school specifically to communicate. Setting expectations for when communication is being facilitated, when it's happening, and setting that up prior possibly as well. Another thing too is just encouraging students to reach out to professors. I think everyone here, well, from my viewpoint, I think everyone understands the importance of students reaching out to professors if they have any questions at all. And then also it was mentioned like legality. There's some universities that recommend and require that you only communicate through email or maybe possibly a different platform specifically. So there's also that. How can that play into defining it in the syllabi? And then also we went on to the studio course description and like what information should be included. And it was discussed just how important it is to put forward possibly the professors or the faculty's viewpoint, and the students are able to respond to that viewpoint, in which the syllabi and the course description can change as more of a discussion, which that second point is also describing that it's an exchange between the faculty and students more than just laying out information. And then it was also discussed, it wasn't necessarily one of these questions, but it was discussed about also possibly here or in a different section in the syllabi, or just in a different document in general, possibly adding like where faculty members can describe any biases they hold on a topic, for both, I don't know, just kind of in general, putting out that communication for future discussions and whatnot. So if I missed anything from anyone in that group that was with me, please pitch in. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing, Shiloh. I know, Laura, you were in the stack.
Yeah, I was actually going to comment on the first group when you touched the where is it, the health and well-being. If I understand, it's like for students to recover from the project. Is that what you meant?
I think for students and faculty, and whoever else might be involved in the context of developing the work.
Yeah, because that's really an interesting point, because I don't know how it is today, but when I was a student, we had this problem with health and well-being, and we had this moment of getting together all the students and having this open letter moment too. So it's really something that I can relate as a student. We had this problem where the projects, they were all asking for deliveries at the same week. And it was something that was happening every year. So it was really exhausting. It was like, I don't know, 1 or 2 weeks of the semester that we wouldn't sleep for, I don't know, maybe 2 days in a row, and we wouldn't be able to recover from anything. And when we tried to approach some of the professors, like talk about with them specifically before going to this higher, using this tool of getting together everybody and talk about it really seriously, because the professors would just laugh and just say, yeah, that was the same with me when I was a student, and we can always, and just joke like, we can always sleep when we are dead. And I don't know if it's still something that happens for you today, but 10 years ago, it was really common, and apparently 25 years ago, it was something common, and they just passed it on, like they used to do the same. Yeah, so it still happens. Yeah, so we tried to do this open letter, and what we get was this kind of common schedule for that year. Like every year we'd have this common schedule, and they would put down the delivered dates of all the disciplines, because apparently the professors were not willing to talk, to conversate, to have this conversation between them. Like, okay, we're going to have this big project delivered this day, so let's try not to put everybody the same week, use the same week to make these major deliveries. So they wouldn't want to do this. So we tried to make this for them. But this was like, yeah, we are going to think about it. Then the action was put this huge calendar inside each studio. You know, each year has one big studio. So we used to have at least basically all the classes in the same space. So that was like the response to put this big schedule. So we didn't get to this part, and I think partially it was my fault, because I was the one that kept talking about the contact info. But yeah, that's really interesting. That still happens, and it's still a major issue, I guess.
Orhan, and then we need to shift the conversation a little bit.
Okay, I would like to de-emphasize on the document I posted in the chat, the original, and I don't really put that in there for any kind of a nostalgia or anything like that. It's a very valid document for exactly about the things that are being discussed today, or in general in the last few weeks in different schools. I just got a similar document that we saw. I mean, what we are talking about from Cal Poly Pomona, for example, it's a very similar sort of, I call it like a student uprising, because that's what I know from my past, being an inaugural student of SciArc. And in that, document, please, I mean, it's kind of an inspiration. It goes all the way to how the students were graded, how they are included in the original philosophy of school, and the decision making. These are all like headings in there. But besides that introduction of that document I posted, what I really want to ask here is how all the work that you are putting together is going to be sustainable, meaning, you know, students being a temporary sort of a station in schools, right? You know, you go to school, you graduate, you're out of it, you know, and new challenges start. But how do you make it, let's say you accomplished about student body involvement in the decision-making process, or the things that, you know, it might work better if they follow these things that, you know, how do you plan this betterments, if there's a word like that, that goes into the next generation? Is it written somewhere? Is it, it becomes, you know, like, how does the administration sort of takes this findings and demands and makes it a part of the school's constitution, let's say, or departments? Is there anybody who would like to talk about that?
Well, I'll actually use your question, Orhan, to catapult us into the next conversation, because what we're trying to do at this point is actually try and imagine a larger sort of motivation or goal for the work that we're doing. And I think that we could direct it in that sense in terms of how do we actually start to build in a kind of constitutional document that transcends generations. We also could just talk about specific goals that we think all syllabi might need to incorporate, any number of things. But I think right now what we really are hoping for is an actionable motivation that the lobby can start to work towards, and that this group, as much as you all are willing and able, can continue to help push forward as a way to change architecture education.
And the next meeting, Andrea, is when?
We're gonna
Where you
have the
said
meeting. Yeah, we're gonna have the
discuss.
meeting on Saturday to discuss all of the outcomes from the week, and then we will be reconvening as a kind of organizing group and sending out additional information for the ongoing discussions after that.
So I plan to be there. I'm really curious how this is going to be carried to the next generation, next generation, next generation, so it becomes like a sustainable piece of direction for the coming generations.
So are we. Peggy.
I, in relationship to that last comment, I guess, and because Orhan was talking about administration, I think differently, or maybe it's response, but it's differently, is like, it's not the administration's responsibility, it's the faculty members' responsibility, and this is fluid. And, you know, if it wasn't for administrative paradigms, we would be fine-tuning that syllabus every time, so it would reflect our growing knowledge and the students who contributed to the last course and is changing in this course. So I think it's important that we think of these as not for the rest of eternity, but for that particular moment. But in some ways, this raises a question which I'm interested in, and it's maybe beyond what we want to talk about, Andrea, for this, but is like, are we thinking about architecture education right now as addressing a society and a planet in crisis, and hence that we can be very specific about this? We're not even pretending that we think this is going to be relevant 10 years from now when we don't have a planet. But for right now, this is what needs to happen, and you're not predicting the future. Anyway.
Direct comment to that, Peggy. If we're not predicting the future, what do you see our role as? Like,
organizing to be relevant in current society and politics.
Federico.
I think both the space, I think between both the question from Oran and then Peggy, your responses is, I'll just speak through my own context, which is having seen a school evolve over 10 years without any previous shadow of any other institution or school of architecture in the place. And even then, the ideas that a lot of people were describing in terms of particular exploitation patterns that are tied both to climate, but even personal relationships between faculty and students popped up instantly, because I think, as Peggy, you were mentioning how fluid the relationship is between faculty and the responsibility. I didn't understand the kind of full subjective power that we had as faculty, or that faculty had when I was a student, as much as I did when I was faculty these past 10 years. And how quickly actually change could come once we realized, and this took at least 4 or 5 years, that co-teaching meant that we were teaching in the same curriculum, and that we had a particular direct link to the way that students were imagining their own education, which was unlike the experiences I had as a student. Now, I realize that that's a very particular example, because you don't get to start a school of architecture every day of the week, and I've now come to maybe terms with that. But I also think that there are ways of making changes that reflect the ways in which we think about time within the structures of our studios. For me, those are very practical and simple things, but people seem to be absolutely resistant to them. Like the notion that after a review, even if you want to have one, because many people don't want to have them anymore, you should spend a week to 2 weeks thinking about what just happened and figuring out why certain people had particular challenges that unfolded differently. That seems to be like heresy, that you were somehow like, quote, waste 2 weeks of studio, or a week of studio, or 3 weeks doing that. And to me, that's just something that I saw as very impactful very quickly, and that changed the culture of the school much faster than I anticipated. But that's something that I hope that other faculty and other students, and not because I'm dismissing administration, I think that's certainly a part of it, but I perhaps agree with what you're saying, Peggy, in terms of it's an immediacy now, not I don't have a sense that this will be this way in 20 years.
This is a question to pose, I think, probably to the facilitators. Obviously, you all saw power in a syllabus or in a project brief. I'm curious about how you landed there, and how you might use that argument as a kind of organizing platform for a larger context.
That's a good question, Andrea. I don't know if Dakota and Shiloh have specific insights. I know, Dakota, you recently graduated. Shiloh, you're still studying as well across next year. My just very brief reflection, and I won't add too much of it, is how different those priorities can be institutionally, right? Like I'm in a new role, and I'm trying to learn how much traction this type of thinking can have across a much more diverse set of faculty. And whether we really take seriously the role of the platforms that we use to communicate, whether they're digital or online, like Michael was mentioning, or whether we still hold some of these types of documents like Syllabi that seriously and that close to our kind of educational pedagogies. I don't know, to be honest. I think that this is part of one of the reasons I want to do the workshop, is because I personally am in that kind of moment of transition. And so I'm trying to figure out what it means as a way of communicating with other faculty with some tangible outcomes, which I sometimes feel cannot be communicated very clearly to people. So Syllabi and project briefs in particular still feel like a good way to try and reveal some of our, I think, biases, were the things that were outlined in one of the documents. So that's what I'm anticipating, but I don't know, honestly, how it will unfold. I mean, just to maybe add one more thing, and then I'll open it up. I rightfully or wrongly haven't written a project brief in the last 4 years. I just, all the kind of outcomes I negotiate with students and other faculty in the moment as we reflect on what's going to happen over the next week or two in studio, I just don't. And that's certainly not how I was taught. Certainly not how I practice, right? Where there's a particular kind of pro forma expectation, but from a teaching point of view, it felt like a much closer way of understanding a particular set of expectations across both ways. And I've learned quite a bit from doing that over the past few years. And I'd like to sustain that, but I realize that that also erases perhaps what people would call institutional memory, right? Like there's no project brief. Yeah, it's all online though. I think Peggy, you're in the stack.
You're muted, Peggy.
Yeah, I'm just wondering for the facilitators and Andrea, whether the action items that come out of this can be worked on with Lori's and the Syracuse group on pedagogical transparency, because those of us who are at both things, it's like the ideals are so similar, but the process is so different. You know, both are looking for transparency, blah, blah, blah. For example, they were very, very clear that you should get everything written down because the discussion, you know, I'm just going to do the most boring syllabus because when I offer it, then I will talk, you know, this me, this whatever, blah, blah, blah. And that more and more students aren't taking that in, that they need documents to refer to. So I don't know. So it would, I just wonder whether we can have synthesized, not learning outcomes, but action items from sessions that are so similar, which might really go a long way to helping us in the lobby not have to do that.
Yeah, I would posit that that might be step 2, because I think that there are going to be 2 really interesting kind of positions that come out of this, and I would like to have them both represented, and then we might have a kind of coming together after that. And to that point, since we're at time, what I've been doing with the other sessions is just setting up a Google document wherein we can all kind of continue to collectively work on 1 to 2 sentences that we think is actionable from this point. So I will share that Google document later today with everyone via the Lumo platform. And I'll include the notes that I have in it just as a kind of background, and we can start to write that together. That'll be due at around 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Friday. The lobby folks will look at all of this material and present it on Saturday during the closing plenary. Hopefully Federico, Dakota, Shiloh, at least one of you can be there to represent this group during that time.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, thank you all so much for spending a couple hours with us, whatever time of day you have. Really appreciate the conversation. It's been very enlightening. Federico, Dakota, and Shiloh, if you don't mind sticking around for just a second afterwards. Otherwise, everyone else, have a good day. Cool. The only reason I was having you guys stick around is because I think the Miro board is fantastic. And I'm trying to find a way to maybe pull the content from all 3 maybe into one. That way it can be a sort of singular visual that we can work with. So if you have time to orchestrate that, that would be awesome. If not, let me know and I'll try to find a moment.
No, I think I can do that. It's something that I was anticipating doing anyway, because each group had their own approach for how to make notes. So I thought that I could take one of the 10 different layouts and I could just synthesize some of them together, because I think that you're right, that would be helpful. There were certainly probably some overlaps, but also just some ways of articulating different parts of that generic template. I think people latched on to different pieces of it, and I find that also pretty interesting too. So yeah, I'll absolutely spend some time doing that.
Cool. I hope that was useful.
Yes, I think it was. I don't know how you all felt about it, but
I thought it was a lot of fun. Just kind of hearing like other educators like talk about like their experiences and with I forgot his name, the guy from SciArc, kind of his experience and everything, and how it changed, and how he shared his story about the like founding document and everything. I don't know, I thought it was really interesting, and just I think one of the big things was just having just general discussions on a lot of this stuff, and like how can it actually be changed in that way. I don't know. So
Yeah, I'll basically just echo Dakota too a little bit. Pretty much the same thing. I thought it was very insightful. And it also just has me thinking possibly like what we as students, because I'm going back again this fall, what we as students can do. So in regards to like syllabi, course descriptions, and the like. So yeah.
That's awesome. What's the best we could hope for?
yeah, I just one thing that I wanted to mention, and just because it's something that I'm always, especially after the 2 hours, kind of caught between, is that there seems to be a type of need for some major, just like major change, right? And then there's also, and this is where I'm caught, there's also the commitment to very small things that you can and should do and convince others around you to do with you, or change your own perception of things. And it feels sometimes that those are at odds, right? Do you understand what I mean? Like there's like just for example, like the idea that we can't even talk about genuine structural change if people can't agree on how to give up time in their own studios. And so that, to me, I'm always kind of caught in between those things, where I realize that we all want to have very actionable, large scale things, but then I always take a step back, and I'm always thinking, well, what about the micro things that can be done every day, even things relative to care? Because that's one of the things I struggle with the most, even certainly in teaching, is not recognizing when I actually have to do that. And I wonder if some of that, I'm really curious to see how all the learning outcomes address that type of range of possibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. Cool. All right, well, I will let you get about your day's meeting.
Thank you, Andrea. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Have a good one.
Dakota, thank you.
Bye.